The carriage wheel struck a stone in the road, and the whole vehicle lurched sideways. Clara caught the leather strap above the door and held on. Outside the window, the moors went on in every direction, without a single point of comfort. Just gray sky pressing flat against gray land, and the wind moving through the dead grass in long, purposeful waves, as though this landscape had decided against warmth a long time ago, and had no interest in reconsidering. She had been traveling for 11 hours. The train from London had taken most of the day, and then a hired carriage had carried her north from Newcastle for another 2 hours, through country that grew emptier and wilder with every mile. The driver, a quiet man named Arthur who had been sent by Mr. Pierce to collect her, had said almost nothing since the station platform. He had loaded her 2 trunks with the careful efficiency of someone who had done this many times, climbed to his seat, and set off without ceremony. Clara had not minded the silence. She was accustomed to silences. She had grown up in the kind of household where quiet was something to be maintained, rather than filled, where illness was a subject changed quickly in polite conversation, where the girl who needed to sit down in the middle of a walk was a social inconvenience to be managed around, rather than a person to be asked about. She had learned to be still inside silences, the way other people learn to be still inside rooms. What she had not learned to manage was this particular cold. Even in October, London was navigable, but here the wind came off the open moors with an intention that felt almost personal, as though it had been traveling a great distance and resented everything standing in its path. Clara felt it in her chest, before the carriage door had even opened. A tightening, a pressure settling behind her ribs, the familiar signal. She had known it since she was 7 years old, and would likely know it for the rest of her life. She adjusted the wool blanket over her lap, pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, and breathed through the fabric in the slow, deliberate rhythm that was as natural to her now as walking was to other people. She counted breaths the way her first doctor had taught her. In through the nose, slowly. Hold for 2 counts. Out through the mouth, controlled. She did not think of this as managing her illness. She thought of it as simply living, which was what it was. The carriage turned off the main road onto a long gravel drive flanked by overgrown hedgerows. Through the gap between the branches she caught her first sight of Renly Manor, and she understood immediately why no one had prepared her for it. It was not what she had expected. She had expected something modest, some northern house of manageable proportion that a duke who had lost interest might have allowed to slide a little. What she found instead was enormous. 3 full stories of gray stone, tall windows running across the entire facade, a roofline of chimneys, and a footprint that seemed, as the carriage rolled closer, to expand rather than contract. The formal garden in front had collapsed entirely into overgrowth, the hedgerows unpruned for years, the lawn gone to rough grass, the beds unrecognizable. A branch lay across the drive, thick as a man's waist, where it had fallen from one of the old elms and been left where it landed. None of the chimneys were smoking. Not one window showed any light at all. There was no one on the steps. Clara looked at all of this from the carriage window for a long, steady moment. She noted the cracked stone on the east corner, the ivy that had grown through the shutter hinges on the second floor, pushing the wood apart, the moss on the stone gateposts, the unswept drive, the debris of a season or 2 of minor winds and storms, simply left where it had fallen because there was no one whose particular job it was to move it. She filed all of it, without alarm and without sentiment, just accurate record-keeping. The carriage stopped. Arthur came around and opened the door. Clara took his offered hand and stepped out, and the moor wind hit her immediately across the face and chest, sharp and cold and entirely certain of itself. She breathed through it deliberately. She straightened her coat. She looked at the manor. The front door opened. An elderly man came down the steps toward her, with careful, deliberate dignity, white-haired, straight-backed, with the composed expression of a person who had been gathering themselves for this moment for the past several hours. He bowed at the bottom of the steps. "Your Grace," he said, "I am William Pierce. I have managed this estate for 40 years. Welcome to Renly Manor." "Thank you, Mr. Pierce," Clara said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced that steadiness on the train. "It is very good to meet you." She saw him assess her in the brief, experienced way of a man who has managed estates long enough to know that new variables must be accurately calibrated from the outset. He noted her slight frame, her pallor, the handkerchief she was tucking back into her sleeve. She watched him form an opinion, and then deliberately set it aside, reserving judgment for evidence. "There is a fire in the sitting room," he said. "Please come in." The entrance hall was the largest single interior space Clara had ever stood in. The ceiling was 20 feet overhead at least. The staircase ahead split at the landing into two directions. The walls on both sides held paintings, but they were so filmed with dust that the subjects were barely distinguishable. The marble floor had been recently swept and polished. Someone had worked hard on this room today, in preparation, but the cold in it was stone cold. The cold that lives in the material itself and ignores everything the air is doing around it. Near the foot of the stairs stood a small, round woman of perhaps 60, with gray hair under a white cap and an expression that was doing considerable work at being neutral and not entirely succeeding. She had the look of someone who has been hoping for something for a very long time and is not yet ready to believe it has arrived. "This is Dorothy," Mr. Pierce said. "She has served the manor for 32 years. "Dottie," the woman said immediately, then seemed startled by her own directness. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace. That is simply what people call me." "Then it is what I will call you," Clara said, and something in Dottie's face released, very slightly, like a lock turning. Mr. Pierce led her through a door off the hall into a sitting room, where, as promised, a fire was burning. It was doing its best in a room that had been cold and closed for too long for one afternoon fire to address more than the edges of the chill. The furniture was uncovered. She had expected dust sheets, but stiff with age, and the upholstery faded. A small table near the hearth held a tea service that had been assembled with genuine care. The pot warm, the cups clean. A small plate of biscuits that had clearly come from someone's personal supply, rather than any household stock. She drank the tea and let its warmth move through her chest. She looked around the room with the same calm, cataloging attention she had given the exterior. Mr. Pierce hovered near the door. "Please, sit down, Mr. Pierce," she said. He sat on the edge of a chair, with the posture of a man who was not certain whether sitting was appropriate, but who was choosing, because she had asked, to comply. "Tell me about the household," she said. He told her. 3 staff total, himself included. Dorothy, Dottie, came every day. The cook, a woman named Ruth from the village, came 3 mornings a week and prepared food in advance for the remaining days. The grounds were managed by a local man named Ned, who came once a fortnight, though Pierce admitted with careful neutrality that this had not been adequate for several years. "And the house itself?" Clara said. He paused and chose his words. "The structure is entirely sound," he said. "There is window damage in the east wing from last winter's storms. 3 panes cracked, 1 seal failed. 2 chimneys in the north corridor need sweeping before they can be safely used. The library is in excellent order. The late Duchess maintained it with great care, and I have kept it exactly as she left it." He stopped for a moment. "The rest of the house has been resting." "Resting," Clara said. "Not a question." "His Grace preferred a minimal footprint during his absences," Pierce said, in the practiced neutral tone of a man who has been saying difficult things pleasantly for 4 decades. Clara asked. 11 years, he said, "since the late Duchess passed." Clara looked at the fire. 11 years of minimal footprint. 11 years of 3 staff. A fortnight groundskeeper. Everything sealed and resting. She thought about what this house had been before that. Organized, warm, full of a life that had cared about things. And she thought about what kind of grief produced a decade of this particular response. "Thank you, Mr. Pierce," she said. "That is very helpful. One more question. The greenhouse on the east grounds, the glass structure, is it intact?" He looked mildly surprised. "It has been empty for several years, Your Grace. Whether it holds adequate heat now I cannot say with certainty. George Potts in Aldwych would be the right man to assess it." "I would like to see it tomorrow morning," she said. He nodded and withdrew. Dottie appeared in the doorway again, quiet as a house cat. "Your rooms are ready, ma'am. 2nd floor, east corridor. I have put a hot water bottle in the bed and an extra blanket on the chair." She hesitated. "And I cut some heather from the moor path this morning. It is on your windowsill. I thought it might make the room feel less." She stopped. "Less what?" Clara said. Dottie looked at the floor. "Less like no one had been in it for a while," she said. Clara regarded her for a moment. "Thank you, Dottie," she said. "That was a very kind thing to do." Dottie withdrew with the slightly quickened step of a woman who has said more than she intended and is giving herself a moment to recover. Clara followed more slowly up the grand staircase, along the east corridor to her rooms. Large, cool, smelling of old wood and lavender, and the background note of Northumberland air that had been finding ways into the room through an imperfect window seal for possibly several years. The extra blanket on the chair, the hot water bottle under the coverlet, and on the windowsill, in a small stone vase, a handful of late-season heather in pale purple, the only thing still blooming on the moors at this time of year. She stood and looked at the heather for a moment. Then she changed out of her traveling clothes with the slow, careful efficiency she had practiced since childhood, every movement deliberate, nothing wasted, the body treated as an instrument to be respected rather than fought. She washed her face, braided her hair, and sat on the edge of the bed and breathed through the remaining tightness in her chest, counted, let each exhale carry a little more of the day's cold with it. She was not afraid. She needed to be clear about that, at least to herself. She had understood from the moment Edmund told her she was going north exactly what she was being sent to. She was not naive about it. She was simply a woman who had spent her entire life being managed around rather than included, and who had learned that the correct response to being managed around was not despair, but pragmatism. She was in a house. The house was large and cold and needed a great deal of work. She had been left alone in it. These were facts. She would build a life around them, the way she had built a life around every other set of facts she had been handed, which was by beginning immediately and not waiting to feel better about it first. She lay down. The sheets were cold and then warm. Outside, the Northumberland wind pressed at the window glass with its steady, certain force. She slept. In the morning she woke before 7, dressed in her warmest wool dress, and went down to the kitchen. Ruth arrived at 6:30 on her working mornings, and was at the stove when Clara appeared in the doorway, and the expression on Ruth's face was that of a woman who had arranged a breakfast tray with great care and was watching the person it was intended for walk into her kitchen in boots. "Good morning," Clara said. "Please don't change anything. I only wanted to see the kitchen." Ruth stared at her with the confounded expression of someone whose plan has been quietly reorganized without consultation. "I will have whatever you are making," Clara said, "and when you have a moment, I would like to go through the household menus." She sat at the kitchen table. Ruth gave her porridge and tea. Clara ate and asked sensible questions about what was available locally, what came from Newcastle, what the Manor habitually ordered that was probably unnecessary given the current scale of occupation. She wrote everything down in the leather journal she had brought in her coat pocket. She filled 4 pages before 10 o'clock. After breakfast, Mr. Pierce took her to the greenhouse. It stood at the east end of the grounds, a long glass and iron structure that turned out to be larger than it appeared from the house. The upper sections had cracked panes, 3 on the south face, 2 on the east, and 1 large pane in the north section was missing entirely. The iron door had warped badly in its frame, and Pierce had to put his shoulder against it to force it open. The air inside was different, warmer, damper, carrying the ghost of what had once been a living space, the faintest trace of earth and green things underneath all the cold and the stillness. The planting beds along both walls were dry and empty. The iron shelving was rusted but solid. Leaves had blown in through the broken pane and gathered in the corners. An old coil of rubber hose hung from a hook by the door. Clara walked the full length of it. "The structure is sound," she said. "The iron framework is in good condition. The glass is replaceable and the door can be rehung. The frame is fine, it just needs the hinges adjusted and the bottom shaved." She crouched at one of the planting beds and pressed her hand into the soil, which was dry and compacted but not dead. "This needs compost and turning, a great deal of compost, but the beds themselves are intact." She stood. "I want this in use before winter properly closes in." Pierce was looking at her with an expression she would come to recognize, a cautious recalibration, the expression of a man who has braced for one thing and found something else entirely. "George Potts in Aldwick is the man for the glazing," he said. "He knows this property. He has repaired the east wing windows before." "Please contact him," Clara said. "And I need staff. Please spread word in the village that I am looking for 2 reliable women, 6 days a week, at proper wages." "I will go this afternoon," he said. She nodded and looked once more at the greenhouse, at its good bones, at the afternoon angle of pale sun through the remaining panes, at the size of the planting beds. She thought about what it could be with 2 months of work and consistent attention. She went back to the manor and spent the rest of the morning walking every room with her journal open. She came to the library last. She pushed the door open and stopped. It was extraordinary, not in the way of grandeur, though it was grand enough, with its floor-to-ceiling shelves and its tall window throwing a column of pale light across the floor. It was extraordinary in the way of care. The books were alphabetized. Every section bore a label in a small, neat, unmistakably feminine hand. The leather spines had been dusted recently, not years ago, but this week, the attention evident in the fact that even the lowest shelves, where dust settles most heavily, were as clean as those at eye level. The fireplace was swept. The window seat cushion had been turned to preserve the fabric. Someone had loved this room and had kept loving it after the person who first loved it was gone. She looked at Pierce. "Every week," he said quietly, before she could ask. "I dust the shelves every week." It is what she would have wished. Clara stepped inside. She ran her finger along a row of spines. History, philosophy, poetry, natural science, botany, architecture, travel. The late Duchess of Renly had read across every subject available to her, and had organized her reading with precision and visible affection. She could see it in the labels, which were not merely functional but careful, the handwriting unhurried. She walked to the window seat and looked out at the grounds below, at the greenhouse, at the moors beyond the garden wall. "I will not change anything in this room," she said. Mr. Pierce made a sound that was very small and very controlled and was undeniably something. "Thank you, Your Grace," he said, and it carried 11 years of weight. Clara sat in the armchair near the fireplace that afternoon and wrote 3 letters. One to Edmund's solicitor in London, requesting access to the Household Management Fund, citing the relevant clause from the settlement by memory. One to a supplier in Newcastle for a greenhouse equipment catalogue. One to George Potts, requesting an assessment at his earliest convenience. She sealed all 3, gave them to Pierce, and sat for a while longer in the library after he had gone, alone with the books and the light and the particular quality of peace that comes from having arrived somewhere and found it not beyond your capacity. She was not unhappy. She examined the feeling carefully to be certain, and found it was genuine, not a performance of contentment, but the actual thing. The manor was in a poor state. The man who had sent her here had not looked at her when he did it. The list of work to be done was already very long, and she had not yet seen half the rooms, and none of that was beyond her. She opened her journal to a fresh page and wrote at the top, "What Renly needs." She wrote until Dottie came to light the lamps, and she had filled 12 pages, and on the windowsill in her room upstairs, the heather from the moors was still there, and the library fire was warm, and she thought, "This is where I begin." The solicitor's letter arrived on the 5th day, and Clara read it standing at the hall table in her coat before she had even taken her hat off, because she had been passing through the hall when Dottie brought the post in and there was no reason to delay. Harold Foster, solicitor, had written in the careful, slightly guarded tone of a man assessing a client whose authority he had not yet fully measured. He had released the household management funds. The account details were enclosed. A postscript noted, with professional precision, that any single expenditure exceeding a specified threshold would require the Duke's prior approval. Clara read the postscript twice, noted the threshold figure exactly, and put the letter in her coat pocket. She had been ill that morning, not seriously, just the ordinary difficult morning her lungs produced every few weeks with the reliability of bad weather. Everything had felt tight and effortful, and the stairs had required deliberate management. She had stayed in bed for 2 hours, as her body demanded, counting breaths, drinking the tea Dottie brought without being asked, watching the pale gray light move across the ceiling. She did not resent these mornings. She had resented them once, when she was younger, and did not yet understand that resentment was a drain on resources she needed for other things. Now she simply waited them out, negotiated, gave her body what it demanded, and expected it in return to give her the remainder of the day. By 9 o'clock the tightness had eased to the ordinary background level she could function within, and she had risen, dressed carefully, and come downstairs. By the time the letter arrived, she had already gone through the household account books back 8 years, identified 3 categories of unnecessary expenditure, and written a complete list of first-phase materials, organized by priority and cost. The total was well inside Foster's threshold. She intended to keep it there, until the results made further investment obviously sensible. She found Mr. Pierce in his office. "Please send word to George Potts in Aldwick," she said. "I would like him here by the end of the week to begin the glazing assessment." "Yes, Your Grace." And names from the village. 2 women, reliable, looking for steady work. "I will go this afternoon," he said. He returned Thursday evening with 2 names. Meg Hollis was 20 years old, dark-eyed, with a way of speaking when nervous that was essentially continuous. In the interview, which Clara held at the kitchen table over tea, Meg described in rapid succession everything she could do: cook a little, clean a great deal, carry heavy items, manage stairs in all conditions, work in all weathers, and remain entirely unbothered by spiders, which she mentioned 3 separate times, and apparently considered a significant qualification, given what she had heard about the East Wing. Frances Dyer was 35, solidly built, and not nervous in any detectable way. She walked into the kitchen for her interview, looked around the room once with the assessing gaze of a professional, and said, before Clara had spoken a word, that the window above the sink had lost its caulking and was going to bring damp into the wall by Christmas if nobody dealt with it. Clara hired them both before the tea was finished. George Potts arrived Friday morning. He was a compact, capable man who moved through the East Wing with a measuring tape and worn leather notebook, and the unhurried confidence of a craftsman who has never encountered a problem he did not eventually resolve. He assessed the damage, quoted a reasonable price, and confirmed that the windows were less damaged than they appeared. Then Clara walked him to the greenhouse. He spent 40 minutes inside, measuring, checking the iron framework with a practiced hand, examining the door hinges. When he came out, he said the structure was in better condition than it looked. The framework was solid, the door just needed its hinges aligned, and the bottom edge planed, and with new panes in the upper sections, it would hold its heat adequately through a northern winter. He could begin work in 10 days and finish within a fortnight. Clara paid him a deposit from the household account, confirmed the schedule, and went inside to begin the uncovering of Renly Manor. Because that was what it was. An uncovering. Layer by layer, room by room, the way you uncover something that has been buried for a long time, with care, with patience, and with the understanding that what is underneath may be worth the effort or may need to be let go, but that you cannot know which until you look. Frances and Meg arrived at 7 each morning. Clara met them in the kitchen, went through the day's work, and then moved through the house alongside them as her body permitted. On the better days, she was at the top of the house by 8 and did not stop until noon. On the slower days, she directed from the library and took shorter runs through the rooms, resting in between without apology or drama. They started with the East Wing because it had the worst damage, and because the correct approach to any large problem is to address the most serious thing first, and let that success carry momentum forward. The dust sheets came off the furniture, piece by piece. They shook them out in the yard, folded them, and assessed what was underneath. Some furniture was past saving. Water damage had gotten into 3 chairs and a writing desk, the wood swollen beyond any repair. Clara arranged for these to go to the village church, where the minister confirmed they would be gratefully received. The pieces worth keeping were carried outside on the dry days and aired in the thin November sun, returning inside smelling of cold air and good old wood, and with 11 years of dust beaten out of them, they were, most of them, beautiful. She found the chest on a Thursday. It was Meg who called out, from the back room of the East Wing, a space that had probably been a sitting room at one point. Her voice was controlled and trying to be more controlled than it was. Clara walked down the corridor and found her standing before a large oak chest pushed against the far wall, half hidden by a folding screen that had fallen against it and been left where it fell. The chest was unlocked. Inside, bundles of letters tied with ribbon, a roll of pencil drawings secured with a paper twist, a small brown shoe, the size to fit a child of perhaps 3, a silver-backed hairbrush with initials engraved on the handle that Clara recognized immediately from the library shelf labels, and a painting, approximately 12 inches square, wrapped in cloth. Clara lifted the painting out carefully. She unwrapped it in the corridor by the window, where the gray November light came in most directly. The woman in the portrait looked back at her with the quality of aliveness that only very good portraits achieve, the sense of catching someone between two moments, before they had arranged their face. She was young, perhaps 18 or 19, in a yellow dress, seated in a garden. Not conventionally beautiful, but unmistakably alive in the specific way of people who find the world deeply interesting and cannot help showing it. Clara recognized her from the handwriting on the shelves, from the letters she had read fragments of, from the evidence of a life that had organized and filled and loved this house. She wrapped the painting again and told Meg to leave the room exactly as it was. That evening she carried the chest to the library herself. She sat with it unopened for an hour, reading. Then she opened it and took out one letter, one only, because she was not a person who read other people's private words without deliberate cause. It was dated 1862, addressed to a friend named Charlotte, written in the hand she now knew as well as her own. It was warm and observant and funny, about a visit to a particular beach, about a landlady whose hat had defied engineering, about a baby boy who had recently discovered that the lowest shelf of the library would support his weight, and had celebrated this finding by pulling 3 volumes onto the floor. Clara put the letter down. She looked at the lowest shelf of the library. She sat with what she understood for a while. Then she wrapped the portrait in fresh cloth, secured it with ribbon from Francis's basket, and placed it on the highest shelf behind the row of natural history books, safe, undisturbed, in the room that had belonged to the woman in it. She would know what to do with it when the time came. George Potts returned and worked on the east wing windows for 3 days. By Thursday, the section was sealed. Clara opened the new windows to air the rooms and stood back and watched the cold, clean moor air move through them. The rooms smelled different afterward, not warm yet, but possible. She had the fireplaces swept and lit, and walked through the rooms that evening, feeling the warmth beginning to settle into walls that had not felt it in over a decade. She stood in each doorway for a moment before moving on. She planted the greenhouse in the 3rd week of November, on a dry, cold morning. George Potts had finished the upper glazing and rehung the door the previous week, and the structure now held its heat adequately. Clara planted tulip bulbs in the first bed, blue ones, without examining the choice, and hyacinths in the second. She arranged herbs along the south-facing shelf in clay pots, rosemary, thyme, winter savory. She planted a cutting of heather she had dug from the moor's path on impulse, because it seemed right to have something from out there growing in here. Dottie appeared in the doorway, midway through, and stood watching in the way she sometimes stood in doorways, when she had no immediate task but wanted to be nearby. "My mother grew herbs," she said eventually. "Lavender. She said it kept the bad dreams away." "I have heard that," Clara said, pressing soil carefully around a rosemary cutting. "I have not found it reliable in my own experience, but I admire the optimism behind the idea." Dottie made a sound that was the near relative of a laugh, brief, genuine, catching them both slightly off guard. It settled into the warm air of the greenhouse and stayed there. In the evenings, Clara read in the library. The collection was extraordinary, wide and deep, and organized by someone who had spent decades tending it with both intelligence and affection, and she moved through it with the pleasure of an unexpected gift. Natural history, poetry, architecture, a comprehensive guide to northern garden cultivation that had clearly been sourced specifically for this property. She slept well, better than she had in years. She had wondered whether the cold and the isolation would make things worse. Instead, the opposite had occurred. The regularity of the days, the specific and concrete nature of each morning's tasks, the clean moor air even in its harshness, something in all of it suited her in a way she had not anticipated. She still had difficult mornings, as she always had, but between them she was more functional and more fully present than she had ever been in the managed, contained world of her father's house. She was useful here. She had not understood until now, until this scale of usefulness, how much she had needed to be. She wrote twice to the solicitor in London. Brief, professional summaries of the expenditures, all within threshold, all organized by category. She received brief acknowledgments. Edmund himself did not write. She had not expected him to write. She made no adjustment for this. She was building something here, and she was building it for its own sake, because it deserved to be built. Whether Edmund ever arrived to see it was a separate question from whether the building was worth doing. It was worth doing. She could see this every morning when she came down the stairs into a hall that smelled of beeswax instead of cold dust, and heard fires going in rooms that had been silent for 11 years, and saw Dottie's face carrying a warmth it had not carried when Clara arrived in October. The house was not yet what it should be, but it was no longer what it had been. That was something. That was, in fact, a great deal. She sat in the library one evening in late November, with the wind at the windows and the fire at her back, and the late Duchess's copy of a novel whose spine had been cracked from 100 readings open in her lap, and she was not lonely, and she was not unhappy, and she thought, I did not know, when I came here, that a person could be given an empty house and find, inside the emptiness, exactly the space they needed. She picked up her pen and added 3 more items to the list. The days that followed had their own rhythm, and Clara settled into it the way she had always settled into difficulty, by paying close attention to what was actually there, rather than what she had expected to find. She had expected, in October, a house that would be hard to bear. She had expected loneliness, of the kind that hollows rather than simply empties, the kind that makes you smaller rather than simply alone. She had expected to spend her days managing a property in the most minimal sense, reading and resting and waiting for something she had not precisely defined, in a cold building in a part of the country she did not know, with a husband who was elsewhere, and a staff that was not sufficient. What she found instead was that the house had opinions. Not dramatic opinions. It was not a house that announced its preferences loudly. It had the opinions of something very old and very patient, which expressed themselves in small, specific ways that you only noticed if you were paying attention. The library was happy when it was used. She could feel it in the quality of the air, the way the room seemed to settle more comfortably around her when she sat in it for long periods. The greenhouse, which had been silent and defeated when she arrived, became within 2 weeks of attention, something that felt actively glad to be occupied. She knew this was not rational, and did not particularly care. She had been managing within physical limits her whole life, and had learned that the things other people called rational were often just the things that were comfortable to believe. She preferred to believe what she observed, and what she observed was a house coming back to itself, room by room, week by week, in response to being given care. She told Dottie this one afternoon in December, not as a full statement but as an aside, that the manor seemed to respond to being tended, that it had a quality of aliveness that she had not expected in a building so long unoccupied. Dottie was quiet for a moment. It was always like this when the late Duchess was here, she said. I forgot, in the years between, how a house feels when someone is running it properly. She smoothed her apron. I had got used to it the other way. I had forgotten what the right way felt like. Clara looked at her. Do you remember her well? She asked. The late Duchess. Very well, Dottie said. She was kind to the staff in a way that was real, not performed. She knew our names, and she remembered them from year to year. She asked about people's families, and she remembered what she was told. A pause. She was not easy in the sense of being soft. She had high standards, but she had them for herself first, which made them feel fair when she had them for others. Clara thought about this. She sounds like someone I would have liked to know, she said. Dottie made a small sound that was not quite words. You would have got on, she said, and left it there. Francis and Meg had settled into the work with the particular efficiency of people who had been given a clear task and sufficient resources and trusted to execute it. Francis, who had a craftsperson's eye for quality and no patience for anything less, had taken on the role of assessor. She was the one who identified what was worth keeping and what was not, what could be repaired and what should be released. Meg, who had energy in quantities that Clara sometimes found slightly awe-inspiring, was the one who moved things and carried things and climbed ladders and went into spaces that were too small or too high for anyone else to want to go. They had found, in the 3rd week, a sealed room on the 3rd floor that no one had mentioned. Not a secret room. It was simply a room that had been sealed at some point and then apparently forgotten, or at least not discussed. The door was locked from the outside. Clara found the key in the desk in Pierce's office after 15 minutes of looking, and they opened it together on a Thursday afternoon. Inside was furniture from the late Duchess's sitting room, pieces that had been moved there, Clara suspected, in the aftermath of her death, by someone who could not bear to see them in their usual place, and was not yet ready to let them go entirely. A settee with pale blue upholstery, dust-covered but intact. 2 small occasional tables, a box of books, a framed embroidery, in a style that suggested it had been made rather than bought, mounted, and waiting for a wall. Clara looked at these things for a long time. Then she said, to Meg and Francis, "Please clean everything carefully. I want to bring the settee down to the library. The tables can go in the sitting room. The embroidery—" She looked at it. It was a piece of genuine quality, the colors still vivid under the dust. The embroidery belongs in the library as well. She had it hung above the window seat, where the afternoon light would catch it. Mr. Pierce came to the library that evening and stood looking at the embroidery for a long moment. "She made that," he said, "the late Duchess, before she was ill. It took her 2 winters. I thought it might be hers," Clara said. He looked at the room, the embroidery, the settee, the clean shelves, the fire, the vase of heather on the windowsill. He said nothing. He did not need to. On a Thursday in the first week of December, Clara walked to the village and spent the afternoon at the school. The children had begun to expect her on Thursdays, which meant that when she arrived, there was a quality of preparedness to the room. Nothing ostentatious, just the particular alertness of 12 people who have anticipated something and are pleased to have been correct. William Marsh had a question prepared. He always had a question prepared. This Thursday it was about the moors. Why did nothing grow on them but grass and heather? And was it true that the moors had once been forests? And what had happened to the trees? Clara sat down in the spare chair beside Helen's desk and answered the question. She talked about peat bogs and soil acidity, and the history of human habitation in the north, and the way landscapes changed over long periods of time. The 12 children listened, with the complete, unguarded attention of people who are genuinely interested rather than performing interest. She walked home in the late afternoon, with the moors stretching out on both sides of the lane, gray and gold in the winter light, and thought about the 12 children in that classroom who were growing up in this landscape and learning to ask questions about it. She thought, this is also part of what needs to be done, not just the house, the village and the school, and the connection between the manor and the place it sits in, which had been severed for 11 years, and which she was, in small and specific ways, beginning to restore. She added a line to the list that evening. She wrote to the Newcastle supplier about additional books. The first time Clara walked to the village, she went without telling anyone. She put on her coat and her sturdiest boots one Tuesday morning, in mid-November, and walked down the front drive and along the lane. The village of Renly-on-Moor announced itself through a dip in the land, and then a rise, and there it was, small, self-contained, gathered around a green with the matter-of-fact permanence of a place that has been in the same spot for several centuries and sees no reason to move. A main street with a post office and a general store with a green-painted front, a church with a square Norman tower, perhaps 30 houses in various states of competent upkeep. At the far end of the street, set back from the road behind a low stone wall, a school, a low stone building with a wooden sign above the door, and 3 children visible in the yard, running circuits of the bare earth space, with the absolute joyful commitment that children apply to running when they are permitted to. Clara watched them from the gate for a moment. Then she pushed it open and went in. The teacher appeared at the schoolhouse door. She was young, not much older than Clara herself, with spectacles that had been slightly bent and repaired with a twist of wire at the bridge, ink on 2 fingers of her right hand, and an expression of complete and genuine surprise that she was working to compose with varying success. "Your Grace," she said, and attempted a bow. "Please don't," Clara said. "My name is Clara. Are you the teacher here?" The teacher confirmed that she was. Her name was Helen Marsh. She had been in the post for 3 years, having come north from a school in Durham when the previous teacher retired, and the village found itself needing someone and not having many candidates willing to live this far north. She taught all 12 village children, ages 5 to 13, in a single classroom. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, natural history, and whatever else seemed necessary, with the resources available to her, which she described with careful understatement. Clara asked to see the classroom. Helen looked as though no one had ever asked this before. She stepped back and let Clara through. The room was clean and organized. Helen Marsh clearly believed that order was its own kind of resource, but was operating well below what it needed. 2 bookshelves between the windows held perhaps 30 volumes, most worn to the binding. The maps on the walls showed a version of the world that was nearly 20 years out of date. The writing slates were cracked, and there were only 10 of them for 12 children, which meant 2 children at any given time were sharing, which Helen noted with the quiet exasperation of someone who has filed this complaint in her own head many times. Clara walked the length of the room. "I have duplicated books in the Manor library," she said. "I will send them with Mr. Pierce next week. 2 crates at least, possibly 3. There is also a globe in one of the East Wing rooms that needs minor repair to the mounting, but is otherwise good. And I noticed the arithmetic primers on the lower shelf are missing several volumes. I will contact a supplier in Newcastle." Helen Marsh looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a person who has been managing without help for so long that help arriving feels almost too sudden to immediately absorb. "That would be of very considerable value," she said quietly. "Thank you, Clara." She had remembered the name. Clara noticed this. She stayed 3 hours. She had not intended 3 hours, but Helen Marsh was interesting, and the children were interesting, and the classroom itself, even under-resourced, was alive in the way that spaces occupied by genuinely curious children always are, full of small investigations pinned to the walls and drawings tacked above the shelves. The children noticed Clara with the complete, unguarded attention of people who have not yet learned to pretend otherwise. They asked questions with equal directness. A girl named Elsie, who was 7 and spoke with careful precision, asked what the manor was like inside and whether the stories about it being haunted were true. Clara said the manor was large and cold and being improved, and that she had not encountered any ghosts, though the house made certain sounds in the night that were, she supposed, open to interpretation. Elsie considered this and accepted it. A boy named William Marsh, Helen's younger brother, as it turned out, 9 years old, with a directness that appeared to be a family characteristic, asked Clara why she had married a duke who was never at home. The room went briefly very quiet. Clara looked at William Marsh. "That is a complicated question," she said, "that I am still working out the answer to." William thought about this, decided it was an honest answer, even if incomplete, and nodded. When Clara left, she promised to return on Friday. She returned on Friday, and the Friday after that. Within 2 weeks, the village had noticed her in the way small, close-knit places notice any new element, completely and without pretense. She walked the main street. She went into Charles Webb's general store and introduced herself and asked, with the directness she brought to most things, what the village regularly needed that was difficult to obtain. Charles Webb had been running the store for 20 years and had been composing the answer to that question in his head every day of those 20 years. He produced it with a speed that suggested he had been waiting for someone to ask. Clara spent 40 minutes going through his answer, asking follow-up questions about quantities and frequencies and which suppliers he had tried and found unreliable. She arranged for certain goods to come with the Manor's supply order from Newcastle, available to the store at cost. It was a practical arrangement, not a grand gesture. The Manor was ordering from the same suppliers anyway. But it cut the village's expense on those items substantially, and Charles Webb thanked her with the expression of a man watching a problem he had stopped expecting anyone to address resolve itself quietly. He told his wife that evening that the new Duchess was not what he had anticipated. His wife, who had spoken with Clara twice, said she could have told him that. Clara sent the books to the school. She sent the globe, repaired by Francis. She sent writing slates and arithmetic primers from the Newcastle supplier. She sent a new world map that accurately reflected the current state of several borders that had shifted since the school's previous one was printed. Helen Marsh wrote her a note, professionally worded, but with genuine warmth underneath. Clara wrote back. It was the beginning of a correspondence that became, over the following weeks, something she genuinely looked forward to. The village talked about her, not with the quiet resentment that had accumulated over 11 years of a dark manor and an absent duke. The feeling that something that had once been a source of local warmth and employment had been sealed away without explanation, but with a different tone. Cautious at first, then warmer. The tone of people adjusting an expectation they had held for a long time. Then Meg fell ill. It was a Friday evening in early December. Clara was in the library when she heard it. A sound from below, low and labored. the sound of a person trying not to show how unwell they are and not quite succeeding. She went down immediately and found Meg at the kitchen table with an untouched cup of cold tea and a fever that had clearly been building since at least the day before. "I am fine," Meg said, before Clara had said anything. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes were too bright and her hands were pressed flat against the table, in the way of someone steadying themselves against a solid surface. "You are not fine," Clara said, with the calm certainty of someone who has spent 22 years accurately reading the physical states of people around them. "You are going home to your mother tonight, not tomorrow, tonight." Meg protested. There was the south corridor to finish. Frances needed help with the window that had stuck again. She could. "The south corridor will be there Monday," Clara said, and there was a quality in her voice that was quiet and did not raise itself, and did not need to, because it was entirely certain. Meg stopped arguing. Clara assembled a package from the kitchen, broth that Ruth had made that morning, a jar of good honey from the farm 3 miles up the road, willow bark tea, 2 clean handkerchiefs. She wrapped it in brown paper and walked Meg to the carriage herself, her hand briefly at Meg's back as she climbed in. Then she sent for Dr. Fletcher. Dr. Fletcher arrived 45 minutes later, with his bag and the resigned expression of a man who has been called out late on many Fridays, and has made his peace with it. Clara directed him first to Meg's mother's cottage, because Meg's need was most acute, and he went without argument. He stopped at the Manor on his way home and reported at the front door. Chest fever. A week of rest would see her through. "Good," Clara said. "Please let me know if anything changes." He nodded. Then he paused on the step and looked at her in the professional, assessing way of a man who reads the physical state of the people he encounters as a matter of habit. "And yourself, Your Grace? You look as though you have been rather more active than may be advisable." "I am always slightly more active than is technically advisable," Clara said pleasantly. "I remain well within my usual range, Dr. Fletcher. Thank you for asking." He left with the expression of a man who had more to say, and had decided not to say it this evening. Clara went to the library and sat in the armchair by the fire and allowed herself 15 minutes of simply sitting, not reading, not writing, not planning, just breathing carefully and letting the quiet of the house settle around her. Then she picked up her pen and went back to her list. Mr. Pierce had been watching all of this since October. He was not a man who spoke without reason. He had spent 40 years learning that the difference between useful speech and unnecessary speech was much larger than most people appreciated. He sat at his desk one Tuesday evening in December and looked at a blank page for a long time. Then he wrote a letter to the Duke of Renly. He kept it entirely professional. He reported the repairs, the new staff, the expenditures, the school books, the improved heating arrangements. He signed his name. Then he paused. Below his signature, in writing slightly less composed than the rest, he added one line. "The Manor is brighter than it has been in some years, and Your Grace may wish to know this." He sealed the letter and addressed it to the Edinburgh Club and posted it the following morning. That evening, he told Dottie what he had written, because 40 years of marriage had taught him that transparency was the only reasonable domestic policy. Dottie listened. Then she said, "That is all you put?" He said it was, yes. Dottie looked at the far wall for a moment, with the expression of a woman who had considerably more to say, and was choosing, on this occasion, not to say any of it. The Manor that night was warm and lit and occupied. Fires in the grates, Dottie's hymns somewhere in the upper floors, Clara's lamp burning in the library, the wind at the windows finding, now, walls that were cared for. Mr. Pierce sat in his chair and hoped, for the first time in 11 years, that the Duke would actually do something useful with his mail. The days after Meg's illness carried on, in the particular productive quiet that Clara had come to think of as Renly's natural register, not silent, not loud, but working. Frances and Meg were back to their normal rhythm. George Potts had come and gone, and the east wing was sealed against the weather. The greenhouse, through its new glass, collected what warmth the winter sun offered, and held it adequately. Clara went to the school on Thursdays. She wrote to suppliers on Mondays. She walked the grounds on the dry mornings, and the corridors on the wet ones, always with the journal, always adding to the list rather than depleting it, because the more she understood the house, the more she found that needed understanding. She found, in the 4th week of December, a second sealed alcove. This one was in the long gallery on the second floor, behind a wooden panel that she had noticed because the paint finish on it was slightly different from the adjacent panels, newer, or rather different-aged, suggesting it had been replaced at some point when the others had not. She pressed it, and it swung inward on the same simple catch mechanism as the east wing alcove. Inside was a box, rather than a painting, a wooden box with a brass latch, small enough to carry in one hand. She took it to the library and opened it. Inside, a journal, the late Duchess's own hand on the first page, dated 1868. Not a diary in the personal sense, no emotional records, no accounts of daily feeling. A working journal of the sort that a person who runs a large household keeps. Schedules, accounts, staff notes, garden plans, records of repairs and improvements, and the decisions made about them. Clara read through it with the specific attention of someone who has been doing the same work in a similar house and is deeply interested in the decisions of a predecessor. She read it across 3 evenings. By the end, she felt she knew the late Duchess more clearly than she had from the letters, which had shown her to family and friends. The working journal showed her to herself, how she thought, how she prioritized, how she made decisions when the decision was difficult and there was no obvious right answer. She was methodical, and she was practical, and she had a deep, consistent interest in the people around her that showed up not in sentiment but in attention. Detailed notes on staff, their particular skills and limitations, what they needed to do their best work. Clara read a note about Dottie that made her set the journal down for a moment. Dorothy responds best to being trusted with the full picture, the Duchess had written. She is not a woman who manages uncertainty well, but she manages responsibility with absolute dependability. Give her the whole picture and the full responsibility, and she will not disappoint you. Do not give her half of either. Clara looked across the library at the door Dottie had recently gone through, carrying a lamp and a bucket. She thought, yes, that is exactly right. She put the journal with the chest for safekeeping, and the following morning went to find Dottie and gave her the full household keys, not a subset, not the ones she had already had access to, but all of them, and told her that she was, from this point, to consider herself housekeeper of Renly Manor, with the full authority that entailed. Dottie looked at the keys for a long moment. "Thank you, ma'am," she said. Her voice was entirely steady, and had an undertone that Clara recognized as the precise quality of feeling when something long overdue has finally arrived. She went back to her work. Clara went back to the list. The snow came in the second week of January. Not the paralyzing snow of a severe winter, but a proper covering that lay across the moors and the grounds for 5 days, and transformed the landscape into something spare and white and very beautiful. Clara stood at the library window each morning and watched the light change across it, the way the blue shadows moved in the hours before the sun was fully up, the way everything simplified and clarified under the white cover. She wrote about it in her journal, not in the working section. She had a separate section at the back for other things, observations that were not tasks and not plans but simply the record of what she noticed. She had kept journals of this kind since she was 12, when a doctor had suggested that recording what she noticed might be useful for tracking her health, and she had discovered that what she most wanted to record had very little to do with her health at all. She wrote about the snow. She wrote about Dottie's face when she received the keys. She wrote about William Marsh's question about the forests. She wrote about the second alcove and the working journal, and what it meant to feel, in the middle of a cold January, that she understood something about the person who had run this house before her. She was, she thought, building something in this house, and also in herself. A kind of knowledge and a kind of confidence that she had not had when she arrived in October. Not confidence in the performed sense, the kind that announces itself. Confidence in the structural sense, a solid understanding of what she was doing and why, and a well-founded trust that she was doing it correctly. She was grateful for it. She had not expected it. She added it to the list of things Renly had given her that she had not thought to ask for. The letter from Pierce arrived at the Edinburgh offices of Baird and Drummond on a Tuesday afternoon, forwarded from the club, where Edmund had not been in 3 weeks. He read it at his desk. He read it twice, and then sat very still with it on the desk in front of him. Henry Baird came to the door, saw the quality of the stillness, and left again without speaking. He was a perceptive man, Baird. He had worked with Edmund Ashford for 2 years, and had learned that certain silences required immediate departure. Edmund read the letter a third time. He stopped at the last line. The manor is brighter than it has been in some years. He put it down and looked out the window. Edinburgh in December was grey stone and wet pavement, and people moving quickly through the cold. He had been here since August. He had arrived intending to stay through the critical phase of the Newcastle contracts and return to London by October. It was December. The contracts were proceeding without incident, and he was still here. He had been sleeping badly for 3 months. He had not mentioned this to anyone. His secretary had noticed. Without saying anything about noticing, he had started leaving a pot of tea on the desk at 8 in the evening, which was its own kind of communication. Edmund had drunk the tea without comment and kept working. He was short-tempered in the mornings. He had snapped at the secretary twice and been irritated at himself both times, which was unusual. His standard response to irritation was to work more efficiently until it had no room. Recently, efficiency had not been quite sufficient. He had also been thinking about Renly Manor with increasing frequency and decreasing ability to redirect himself. He thought about the library specifically, not about the manor in general, but the library, with its particular light in the late afternoons and his mother's handwriting on every shelf label. He thought about the greenhouse his mother had been building in the last year of her life. He thought about Clara, in the fragmented, persistent way that indicated not casual awareness, but sustained low-level preoccupation. The kind a person's mind maintains about things it has decided are significant, regardless of whether the person has agreed. He thought about how she had thanked him when he told her she was going north. A genuine, simple thank you, for something he had not done thanksworthy. He thought about the heather in the desk drawer. He had put it there the day the Christmas card arrived, and had not moved it since. Stuart Drummond appeared at the door at 7:30 with a file of papers, and the expression of a man who has been forming a particular sentence for several days, and has decided tonight to say it. He set the file on the desk and sat down without being asked. "Go home," he said. Edmund said he was in the middle of the Newcastle tender documents. The Newcastle tender documents are 3 weeks ahead of schedule, and require nothing from you for the next fortnight. That cannot be provided by post, Drummond said. He was a plain-speaking man, and had no patience for indirection. You have been here since August, Edmund. It is December. The work is not what is keeping you. Edmund said nothing. Whatever you are not thinking about, Drummond said, you are thinking about it constantly. You are simply declining to go and deal with it. Edmund looked at the letter on his desk. The estate needs an inspection, he said. There have been significant repairs. Drummond stood up. Then go inspect it, he said, and left. Edmund sat for another hour after Drummond had gone. He read the solicitor's quarterly summary again, the expenditures from the household account, all carefully categorized, all within threshold, all evidencing a level of intelligence and systematic attention that he had not authorized and had not expected. He had read this summary 3 times when it arrived. He had told himself it was financial oversight. He had believed this the first time. He booked a train to London the next morning. Not north. London first. He had meetings he had been postponing. A solicitor to see. Legitimate reasons to be in London for a few days. In London, he attended 1 meeting in 2 days and missed 2 others. He ate at his club and could not remember an hour later what had been served. He walked home through Mayfair in the rain without a hat and kept walking past the point where any reasonable person would turn back, through the park and along the King's Road, and found himself standing in front of a greenhouse shop he had noticed 4 weeks ago and not entered. He went inside. He walked the aisles. He picked up a packet of winter savory and read the cultivation notes. He set it down. He picked up thyme. He read those notes. He bought both packets. He also bought tulip bulbs, blue, without looking at the other colors, and hyacinth bulbs, and a small pot of rosemary cutting that the proprietor recommended for any south-facing shelf. He carried everything to the counter. He had also, without noticing when it happened, picked up a pair of gardening gloves. The proprietor wrapped the rosemary in paper and asked cheerfully what he was planning to grow. Edmund looked at the items on the counter. "I am not entirely certain," he said, which was the most honest thing he had said to anyone in months. He carried everything back to his Edinburgh rooms on the train. He watered the rosemary and put it on the windowsill of his north-facing room, and then moved the table in front of the window to give it as much light as possible, and stood back and looked at it. A man who lived in rented rooms in Edinburgh and did not own a garden, was growing rosemary. He sat on the edge of his bed. He looked at the rosemary. He opened the desk drawer and looked at the pressed heather from Clara's Christmas card. A small piece, perfectly dried, the pale purple flowers still intact. Heather from the Renly moors. She had gathered it herself. He had received gifts from people over the years. Fine things, carefully sourced, professionally selected. He had not kept any of them with particular attention. He closed the drawer. He wrote a brief message to his secretary in Edinburgh and a note to Drummond, both saying he would be delayed, and neither explaining why, because he had not finished working out the reason himself. He packed the seed packets in his travel bag. He packed the gardening gloves on top. He put the rosemary in a small box with soil packed around the pot to keep it stable on the journey. He booked the train north for the following morning. Not to Edinburgh. All the way north, past every junction he had become familiar with over 4 months. To the market town of Aldwick, nearest point to Renly-on-Moor. He sent a telegram to Arthur. He did not send word to the manor. He told himself this was because an estate inspection did not require advance notice. He was the Duke. He could come and go from his own property as he chose. This was true, and was not the reason. He sat on the edge of his bed that night, and looked at the travel bag, and the rosemary, and the window, and acknowledged, in the private honesty of a room where there was no one to maintain composure for, that he was afraid. Not of the manor, or the cold, or the moors. He was afraid of what Pierce had written. He was afraid the manor had changed, not just repaired, not just maintained, but changed in the way of something returned to life, by someone who understood what life it was meant to have. And he was afraid that when he arrived, he would find evidence of warmth in a place he had spent 11 years keeping cold, and that he would not be able to remain unchanged by it. He was afraid of what it would ask of him. He caught the morning train. He did not sleep on it. He sat with his hands folded in his lap and watched the landscape change. London to countryside to the wide emptiness of the far north. And he did not think about contracts or maps or the meetings he had postponed. He thought about a library with labels in his mother's handwriting, and a woman who had been left alone in a cold house and had not waited for anyone to make it inhabitable. He thought about what that said about her. He thought about what his departure in October said about him. He let it sit with him on the train, all of it, as the miles went by and the sky grew wider and the land went flat and vast, and by the time Arthur met him on the platform at Aldwick, the thing he was most certain of was that he was not going to pretend, this time, that he was here for an inspection. He was here because something was happening at Renly Manor, and he had been running from it long enough. He spent 2 days in London before the northbound train, and those 2 days had their own instructive quality. He had thought, leaving Edinburgh, that London would be the familiar city of meetings and clubs and the particular regulated social life of a man in his position. He found instead that London felt small and slightly airless, the clubs too enclosed, the meetings too abstract, the conversations in drawing rooms too carefully managed to resemble anything true. He had a dinner at his cousin Frederick's house in Belgravia on the second night. Frederick was a cheerful, uncomplicated man who collected racing prints and had opinions about horses. His wife Charlotte was kind and well-organized, and had been asking Edmund for 3 years when he intended to do something about the Renly estate. At dinner she asked him again, in her pleasant, persistent way. "It is being attended to," he said. Charlotte looked at him with the considering expression of a woman who has learned to read the people at her dinner table. "By whom?" she said. "By my wife," he said, and heard himself say it, and found that he was, somewhat to his own surprise, quietly proud. Charlotte's expression shifted into something he could not immediately read. She looked at her husband across the table. Frederick was paying attention to his soup. "I had not realized you were in contact with her," Charlotte said carefully. "I was not," Edmund said. "Pierce wrote to me, and then I read the solicitor's quarterly summaries more carefully than I usually do." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "Edmund," she said, "is she well? Clara, your wife, is she well up there?" He thought about the question. "She appears to be," he said. "Better than well, from what the accounts suggest." Charlotte looked at him with an expression that combined exasperation and something warmer. "You should go and see for yourself," she said. He said that he intended to. She looked at him for another moment, in the way of a woman who has more to say, and has decided that she has said enough for now. He left the following morning. On the train he thought about Charlotte's question. Is she well? He realized he had not asked himself this question before. He had thought about what Clara was doing. The accounts confirmed that she was doing a great deal, but he had not thought about whether she was well in herself, whether the situation he had placed her in was one she could sustain, whether the lung condition that had been part of every description of her had gotten better or worse in a Northumberland winter. He thought about this for several miles and found that the not knowing made him uncomfortable in a specific and useful way. He was going to Renly. He would see for himself. He looked out at the landscape going past the window. Flat midlands giving way to hills, giving way to the wider, cleaner spaces of the north. He had made this journey many times in his life, as a child going to Renly and as an adult going to Edinburgh, and he had never paid particular attention to the geography in between. Today he noticed it. He noticed the shift in the light as they moved north, the way the sky opened up and became more sky and less ceiling, the way the land simplified, and the distances became real distances, rather than the managed, arranged distances of the south. He thought, I have been living in rooms. I have been living in a city in rooms, and choosing to stay in the rooms even when the rooms stopped serving any particular purpose, because staying in the rooms meant not having to go anywhere else. He thought, I am going somewhere else. He arrived at Aldwych in the morning, and Arthur was there, and the carriage smelled of cold leather, and the moors stretched out in every direction, under a pale winter sky. And Edmund looked at all of it, and thought, here, I am here. Whatever happens next, I am here. Clara found the portrait on a Wednesday morning, when she was checking the east wing sitting room for damp. She had been pressing the wall panels methodically along their edges, assessing whether the slight warping at the top right corner indicated moisture, when the seam of one panel gave inward under her hand. Not a loose panel, a hinged one, with a small catch disguised in the trim. She pressed it, and the panel swung open on its hinge, to reveal a shallow alcove, perhaps 2 feet deep and 4 feet wide. Inside, a painting wrapped in cloth, leaning against the back wall. She reached in and took it. She unwrapped it in the corridor by the window, where the gray morning light came in most directly. She had built a picture of the late Duchess over the preceding weeks from many sources: letters, records, the handwriting on every library shelf, the evidence of a mind that had organized and filled and loved this house. She recognized the woman in the portrait before she had consciously confirmed it. The yellow dress and the painted garden were the frame. The aliveness in the eyes was what she knew. She looked at the portrait until she felt she had understood what she was holding. Then she wrapped it again and went to find Mr. Pierce. Pierce looked at the alcove and the painting. Something behind his controlled expression moved, old and certain, the look of a man confirming what he has been hoping, but not allowing himself to hope. I did not know it was there, he said. It was deliberately hidden, Clara said. Someone put it here. The late Duchess herself, I would think, he said. In the months before she died, when she understood what was coming. She put things away in various places, safekeeping. His voice was entirely level. I believe she was trying to protect the things she loved. Clara looked at the empty alcove for a moment. I will take care of it, she said. That evening she brought the chest from the back room to the library, and the portrait with it in fresh cloth tied with ribbon. She placed the portrait on the highest shelf behind the row of natural history books. The chest she set against the wall by the fireplace, where it was safe and dry and where it belonged to be. Then she went to her room and sat at the writing desk. She had been thinking about Edmund periodically since October, in the way she thought about most things she did not yet fully understand, with patience, without urgency, gathering information rather than forming conclusions. She thought about a man who had sealed his childhood home against feeling, and who had, in doing so, made the house and himself into the same thing, closed, against everything that could hurt, and therefore also against everything else. She understood wounds of that kind. She had spent 22 years negotiating with her own body. She knew that the things we close off in order to survive can sometimes seal so completely that we forget what we sealed in with them. She put a blank sheet of paper in front of her and looked at it. Then she began. She had not planned a letter. She began with the practical. She needed to tell him about the portrait. She wrote 3 careful paragraphs: the panel, the alcove, the painting inside, what she had done with it. She told him it was in the library whenever he wanted it. And then she kept writing. She wrote about the greenhouse. She told him the tulip bulbs were in the ground, and the hyacinths too, and that the rosemary on the south shelf smelled extraordinary on the warmer afternoons, even in December. She told him the east wing had new windows now, and the wing no longer smelled of rain. She wrote about Helen Marsh and the children, and the globe Francis had repaired. She wrote about William Marsh, asking her the direct question, and about her answer, and about how he had accepted it, with the pragmatism of a child who has been given honesty and recognizes it. She wrote about Dottie's almost laugh in the greenhouse on the morning they planted the herbs. She stopped and read what she had written. 4 pages, both sides, in her clear, unhurried script. 2 hours had passed without her noticing. She went to bed. The next evening, she read the pages again, and continued. She wrote about the library, about the way the afternoon light came through the tall window in the late hours, and went gold and wide across the floor, and changed the quality of everything in the room. About the window seat that she had claimed as her own because it was the best light in the house, and she had decided she had earned it. About the late Duchess's most read novel, identifiable by the cracked spine, the only book on the third shelf whose binding had split from being opened in the same place hundreds of times. She wrote that she was reading it, that it was extraordinary. 3 more pages, 7 total. On the third evening she sat at the desk and did not write. She read all 7 pages from the beginning. She thought about what she had written. It was not a complaint. She had not written a single word of complaint, which she noticed with some interest, not because she was suppressing anything, but because there was genuinely nothing in her that wanted to complain. The situation was what it was. She had made something real within it. Complaining would have required wishing things were different, and she found, examining this honestly, that she did not particularly wish things were different. She wished some things had been different at the very beginning. That was not the same thing. What she had written was the truth of her life here, offered to someone who she thought might need to know that such a truth existed. She folded the pages and slid them into an envelope. She wrote his name on the front, not his title. Edmund, in her own hand. She held the envelope. She thought, if I send this, he may feel obligated. He may come, because he feels obligated. And if he comes from obligation, it will be the wrong kind of coming. And this house has had enough of things happening for the wrong reasons. She thought, I do not know yet if he is ready for this. She thought, truth does not require delivery to remain true. She set the envelope down on the desk. She picked up the natural history of the northern moors she had been reading in pieces, and used the envelope to mark her page, tucking it in at the spine with the folded edge against the binding, out of sight, just paper holding a place in a book. She took the book to the library. She found the gap on the third shelf, between the collection of poems and the volume on English landscape painting, and slid the natural history in. The envelope disappeared between the spines. She stood back. She thought, he will find it when the time is right. And if the time is never right, everything I wrote in it is still true, and truth does not require delivery to remain true. She turned off the lamp. She went to bed and slept without difficulty. In the morning she planted the second wave of bulbs, and did not think about the letter. She thought about the south wing ceilings, and the cracked kitchen flagstone, and the leaning boundary wall, and the time on the greenhouse shelf that needed more water, and she was content, in the particular solid way she had come to understand was available to her here. Not happiness in any large announced sense. Contentment in the structural sense, the kind that comes from being in the right place, doing work that suits what you actually are, surrounded by people becoming, gradually and naturally, exactly the company this particular life attracts. She ate lunch at the kitchen table with Meg, who had recovered from her illness and returned talking faster than ever, deeply indignant about the state of the south corridor, skirting boards, that had apparently developed a new scuff during her absence. Through the kitchen window the greenhouse stood warm and clear in the pale December light. Clara drank her tea and looked at it and thought, I did not know, when I arrived in October, that this is what I was arriving to. I thought I was being set aside, and instead I was being given the thing I had always needed, which was a place large enough to be actually useful in. She picked up her pen and went back to the list. In the days after not sending the letter, Clara found herself in a particular state that she did not immediately have a name for. Not regret. She had made the right decision. She was certain of that. Not longing, exactly, though there was an element of longing in it. Something more like the feeling of having correctly identified a future moment, without knowing when it would arrive, and deciding to trust the timing. She was patient. She had always been patient. Her body had required it of her from the beginning, had trained her in the specific discipline of waiting for things to shift, rather than forcing them to shift before they were ready. She applied this discipline now to the question of Edmund, and found it came naturally. She went to the school on Thursdays. She went to the greenhouse in the mornings. She read in the library in the evenings, and let the late Duchess's collection take her where it wanted to take her, which was across a wide and generous range of subjects. In the second week of January, she found a book she had not seen before. A slender volume wedged behind a row of larger books on the architecture shelf, apparently missed in the original organization. She pulled it out. It was a collection of drawings of northern English manor houses from the previous century, small pen and ink sketches with precise annotations about architectural features and construction dates. She found Renly Manor on the 4th page. The sketch showed the building as it had been in approximately 1740, smaller than it was now, without the East Wing addition, but recognizably itself. The annotations described the original construction in detail. She turned the page. On the facing page, in a hand she now knew as well as her own, was a note written in pencil. The drawing is not quite right. The south face windows are taller than shown here, and the roof pitch steeper. The proportions are approximately correct. Clara looked at the note for a long time. She thought about the late Duchess sitting in this library with this book on her lap, looking at the drawing of her own house, and making a correction in the margin. Not a significant correction, just a note that the drawing was not quite right, offered in the same careful, precise spirit that organized the shelves and planned the greenhouse and wrote detailed accounts of the staff in the working journal. She thought, she was someone who could not see something approximately correct without noting where it diverged from the truth. She thought, I recognize that. She put the book back on the shelf, in its proper place, rather than behind the row where it had been hiding. The snow that came in January lay across the moors for 5 days and changed the quality of the light through the library window in a way that Clara found very beautiful. The reflected brightness of everything white and still outside, making the library itself brighter, the afternoon light going silver instead of gold through the glass. She wrote in her journal. She wrote to Helen Marsh. She wrote to the Newcastle supplier about additional books for the school and received a catalog in return that she went through carefully, and from which she ordered 3 additional sets of primers and a complete new geography text. She thought about Edmund less than she had expected to, which she took as a sign that she was managing her mind correctly. She did not mean she did not think about him at all. She did, periodically, with the patient and curious attention she gave to most problems she had not yet solved. But she did not think about him in the anxious way she might have expected, the way that involves monitoring a situation for signs. She thought about him the way she thought about the bulbs in the greenhouse, something growing underground, in its own time, that would surface when it was ready. She was patient. She was busy. She was, in the particular way that she had come to understand was available to her here, quietly happy. She planted a second row of herbs on the greenhouse shelf in late January, mint in 2 varieties, lemon thyme, and a lavender cutting she had managed to source from a nursery in Newcastle that delivered by rail. The lavender was Dottie's, really, placed where Dottie would see it every morning, and where the late Duchess's prescription for good sleep might be given the chance to work. She did not tell Dottie about the prescription. She simply put the lavender there. Dottie noticed it the following morning and said nothing, but she paused by it for a moment, in a way that suggested she had understood. Edmund did not sleep on the night train north. He sat in his compartment with his coat on and his hands folded in his lap, and watched the northern landscape pass outside the window in the darkness, and he did not read the papers he had brought, or review the accounts he had intended to review on the journey. He sat with the darkness, and the motion, and the particular quiet of a man who has been putting something off for a very long time, and is finally, irrevocably, on his way toward it. The train reached Aldwych at 6:30 in the morning. The platform was nearly empty in the pre-dawn cold. Arthur was there, solid, reliable, unhurried, the same as he had always been. He loaded the bag without comment, and they set off north. The drive to the manor was 40 minutes. The sky lightened gradually, from black to deep gray, to the pale, clear white of a winter morning coming in. The moors opened up on both sides as they left the town behind, stretching flat and enormous in every direction, the long grass silver white with frost. Edmund watched it. He had grown up with this landscape. He had known every variation of it as a child, every season and every light, and the particular smell of it after rain, and the way the color of the heather moved across the hills in waves from summer into autumn. He had stopped seeing it when he stopped coming here, had filed it away as simply a property he owned in the north of England, not different from other northern properties in any way that needed to be felt. He noticed, as the carriage came down the lane toward the Manor drive, that the section of boundary wall he had known to be leaning had been recently repointed. New mortar, pale against the old stone. He had not authorized this specific repair. He noted it without surprise. He noticed the lights. This was the second thing, and it struck him differently. He had arrived at Renly 3 times since his mother's death. 3 times he had crossed the country and come down this lane in a carriage, and every single time the manor had met him exactly as he had left it. Dark, sealed, holding its breath in the way of something told to be still, and being perfectly, obediently still. Now the south parlor window was warm with lamplight. The kitchen too, and on the second floor, the library window glowed gold and steady in the gray morning. Multiple windows. Lit. Arthur stopped the carriage. Edmund got out. The front door opened before he reached the steps. Mr. Pierce stood at the top with 40 years of professional composure intact, and something else, something in the way he held himself that Edmund had never seen from him before, a straightness that was not professional tension but genuine pride, the quiet pride of a man whose long patience has been, at last, vindicated. "Your Grace," he said, "welcome home." Edmund went up the steps and walked through the front door. The entrance hall was warm. He stopped. He had been braced for the cold without knowing he had been braced. The cold had been the first fact of this building on every return since his mother's death. The deep, settled cold of stone that has been minimally heated for 11 years. A cold that expressed itself as an atmosphere rather than just a temperature. A cold that was the building's own particular form of grief. He had walked into it 3 times and found it unchanged. Now it was gone. Not completely. It was winter, and this was a stone house in Northumberland, and there were limits to what any amount of warmth could do with centuries of cold stone. But the cold as a condition, as the dominant fact of the building, that was gone. In its place was the accumulated warmth of fires burning regularly in many rooms over many weeks. He stood in the entrance hall and looked around. The paintings on the walls were clean, the subjects visible again, colors restored to something like what they had been. The marble floor was polished. On the hall table, in a stone pitcher he recognized from the kitchen stores, there were flowers, small white ones he could not name, cut from the ground somewhere, arranged without fuss. He looked at the flowers for a long moment. His mother had always kept flowers on the hall table, not as decoration. She had explained this to him once when he was 12, standing in this exact spot. But because a house needed living things in it to remember what it was for. He had thought it was sentiment and nodded politely. He had been wrong about sentiment. From upstairs, very faintly, came the sound of a voice. Steady, quiet, doing something steady and quiet, not calling out, not speaking to anyone, just present, in the particular way of a person, going about the ordinary business of their morning. "Is the Duchess in?" he said. "She will likely be in the greenhouse at this hour," Pierce said. "Though on a cold morning, she sometimes remains in the library. She may also have gone to the village school. She visits on Thursdays. Or she could be in the kitchen. She takes her breakfast there with the staff." Edmund looked at him. "She takes breakfast in the kitchen," he said. "Every morning," Pierce said, with precise, uninflected delivery. Edmund set his bag down. He looked at the flowers on the table, the clean paintings, the lit hall. He listened to the voice upstairs, steady and present. He walked toward the stairs. Pierce offered to show him to his rooms. "I know where they are," Edmund said, and kept moving. He went up the staircase and along the second-floor corridor. The voice was clearer here, coming from the library. The same door he had known since childhood. The same wood. The same position in the wall. Unchanged. He had stood outside this door more times than he could count, listening for his mother's voice on the other side. He stopped in front of it. He stood there longer than was necessary. Then he pushed it open. She did not hear him come in. She was in the window seat at the far end, the one that caught the morning light in winter, with a book in her lap, and her feet tucked beneath her, and her hair down around her shoulders, wearing a dark green wool dress. She was not reading. She was looking out at the grounds below, with the quality of attention of a person who is completely at rest without being inattentive, present, settled, at ease in the specific way of someone who has arrived somewhere and recognizes it as the right place. He stood in the doorway. She turned. She saw him. Her face did not rearrange itself. No performance, no startlement, no rapid assembly of a correct professional expression. She simply looked at him and recognized him, and her eyes were warm and unhurried and direct. "Your Grace," she said. "You were reading aloud," he said. It was what was in his head, and it came out before any assessment could intercept it. He heard himself say it, and did not try to qualify it. "I find it helps with the breathing," she said, "the rhythm." A brief pause. "I did not know you were coming." "I did not entirely know either," he said. He heard the honesty in it. He had not planned to be honest quite so quickly. But she was looking at him with that clear, unhurried gaze, and saying anything other than the truth seemed not only dishonest but pointless. There was nothing in her expression that required management, nothing that needed to be kept at a distance. She did not look surprised. She looked as though she had expected this, eventually. "Would you like tea?" she said. She called for Dottie. He came inside and sat in the armchair near the fire, the armchair positioned at exactly the angle he would have chosen, as though someone had placed it for this specific body, and it fit him the moment he sat down. Dottie appeared with tea and a plate of shortbread that had not existed 2 minutes ago. They drank tea, and he asked about the East Wing repairs, and she described them precisely. What had been done, in what order, at what cost, every figure sound, and every priority intelligent. He did not argue against any of it, because he could not. Then she asked whether he had eaten. He had not. She went to the door and said something down the corridor, and came back and told him Ruth was in the kitchen that morning and there would be food shortly. He looked at her. "You reorganized the cook's schedule." "She already had her own schedule," Clara said. "I simply wrote a meal plan so the preparation days were used more efficiently." She said she found it clarifying. He thought about this, about a woman who arrived in a cold, underpopulated house and immediately understood that the people in it needed structure and gave it to them. Not because it benefited herself, but because it was correct. "Tell me about the portrait," he said. And she told him everything, the panel, the catch, the alcove, the painting wrapped in cloth. She told him where it was now, and that it would remain there for him whenever he wanted it. He stood up. "Show me," he said. She led him to the library shelves and reached to the high shelf and brought the bundle down and set it on the reading table and stepped back. He unwrapped it himself. He stood over his mother's portrait and said nothing for a long time, and Clara stood a few feet away and also said nothing, and the afternoon light moved slowly across the library floor, and it was, he would understand this later, when he had the language for it, the first time in 11 years that someone had been with him inside his grief, rather than waiting at the edge of it. She did not try to fix it. She did not speak into the silence with comfort. She stood beside him and let it be what it was, and that was the kindest thing anyone had done for him in a very long time. He came down the next morning to find her at the kitchen table, with her journal open, and Ruth at the stove and the kitchen, smelling of bread and wood smoke and something herbal that turned out to be a pot of chamomile tea that Clara had apparently started for herself when the porridge was not quite ready. He sat across from her at the table. Ruth put tea in front of him without being asked. "I would like to walk the full grounds today," Edmund said, "if the weather holds." Clara looked at the kitchen window. "It will hold until afternoon. There is cloud coming from the west after noon. Then we have the morning," he said. "I have the school on Thursdays," she said. "Helen is expecting me." "Then go to the school," he said. "I will walk the grounds, and you can tell me what I miss when you return." She looked at him. She was, he thought, deciding whether this was a reasonable proposition or whether there was something performative about it that she needed to assess. He recognized the assessment. He waited for it. "All right," she said. "The west boundary wall has a section Pierce noted last month as beginning to lean. It is not urgent, but it should be looked at before another winter. And there is a drainage issue at the far end of the kitchen garden that I have not yet found the source of. The water is coming from somewhere it should not. I will look at both, he said. The drain issue will likely require digging, she said. I have been waiting to find a man from the village who could do it. Then I will locate the source, and we can arrange the digging afterward. She looked at him for another moment. Then she wrote something in her journal, turned it around, and pushed it across the table. She had added his name to 2 items on the list. He walked the grounds for 3 hours that morning. He found the leaning section of the west wall. It needed attention, but was not yet a crisis. He found the drainage problem, which turned out to be a blocked culvert that had been directing water underneath the kitchen garden for possibly 2 seasons, which explained the unusual softness of the far bed and the slightly wrong color of the soil in that section. He found other things too, as he walked. The old potting shed at the north end that he had forgotten existed, structurally sound but empty. The remains of what had once been a cutting garden, south of the greenhouse, where the soil was still good under the weeds if someone addressed it. The apple trees at the east boundary that had not been pruned in years but were still producing, still reaching for the light in the determined way of old trees that have decided to outlast their neglect. He came back to the manor at noon, with mud on his boots and more items for the list. Clara returned from the school an hour later. She came in through the kitchen door and found him at the kitchen table with her journal open, adding his notes in the margin beside the items he had been asked to assess. She looked at the open journal and then at him. The culvert is blocked, he said, about 12 feet in from the northwest corner. I have marked the approximate location. It will need digging, but it is straightforward once you reach it. I thought it was something like that, she said, sitting down across from him. She looked at his notes in the margin. Her handwriting and his were very different, hers small and precise, his larger and more angular, but they sat together on the page without conflict. What did you add at the bottom? She said. The cutting garden, he said, south of the greenhouse. The soil is good. I think it could be replanted in spring. She looked at the entry. She looked at him. My mother had a cutting garden there, he said. She used to bring flowers inside every week through the summer. Clara looked at the page. I will add it to the spring list, she said, and picked up her pen and wrote it in, below his note, in her precise and careful hand. He dreamed of his mother. She was in the greenhouse, as it had been the last autumn of her life, the seedlings in their first beds, the late afternoon light coming through the glass in long warm columns, the air carrying the smell of earth and green things. She was moving between the planting beds with that light, unhurried step she had always had when she was doing something she loved, checking the soil, adjusting a stake, humming something he could not quite identify. He was there too, but young, 10 or 11, sitting on an overturned wooden bucket near the door with his arms on his knees, watching her. He was not doing anything in the dream, just watching. And everything was ordinary. There was time. He woke in his room at Renly, at 5:30, with the winter dark still at the window, and the sound of the house all around him. He lay still and listened. A door closed gently somewhere below, the sound of a fire being laid in the kitchen, footsteps in the east corridor. Light, steady, the sound of someone moving through a familiar space without needing to think about it. He got up, he dressed and went downstairs. The kitchen was warm. Ruth was at the stove. She looked at him when he appeared in the doorway, with the expression of a woman who was not going to show anything about how unusual this was, and asked whether he would prefer breakfast in the dining room. Here, he said. She gave him tea and porridge, and he sat at the kitchen table. A table he had not sat at since he was a child, and outside the kitchen window he could see the greenhouse. Lit from inside, warm and clear against the gray morning, the amber glow of something inhabited. He put on his coat and went out. Clara was at the south-facing bench working with a row of clay pots, so concentrated on what she was doing that she did not hear the door. She was wearing her heavy coat and a knitted hat pulled down over her ears, hands careful in the soil. He closed the door behind him. The warmth inside was modest but real, different from the air outside in a way that went beyond temperature. She looked up. Good morning, she said, not startled. He was coming to understand she simply did not startle. What are you doing? He asked. Transplanting rosemary, she said. They have outgrown these pots. I should have moved them 2 weeks ago." He looked at the bench, and then at the shelves, the rows of herbs, the pots in various sizes, everything organized by type and need along the south wall. He looked at the far planting beds, where small green points were pushing up from dark soil in regular rows. "My mother planted hyacinths," he said. He had not planned to say it. The greenhouse produced it, the way certain places produce certain memories, not dramatically, not with warning. Clara kept her hands in the soil. She did not adopt the careful sympathy people usually brought to his grief, the expression that always made him stop talking. She just continued. "What color?" she said. "Blue," he said. She always chose blue. "Third bed," Clara said, nodding toward the far end. "I planted blue." He walked to the third bed. The shoots were just visible, small green points, deliberate and determined. "They will not bloom until March," she said. "I know," he said. He did not know if she had chosen blue by intention or by chance. He stood looking at the shoots and decided, after a moment, that the answer did not matter. The result was the same. His mother's hyacinths were coming up in her greenhouse for the first time in 11 years. He turned. "You should not be out in this cold," he said. "Your lungs." She gave him the direct, unhurried gaze of someone assessing the intention behind a statement before responding to it. "My lungs have been managing Northumberland winters since October," she said. "I have their limits thoroughly documented." "I do not doubt it," he said. "I was not questioning your management of them. I was simply concerned." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. And it was an acknowledgement rather than a reassurance. "Thank you." He found this extraordinarily precise, the acknowledgement of genuine concern rather than the performance of receiving it. They stayed in the greenhouse for another half-hour. She finished transplanting the rosemary, while he walked the space, examining the glazing, the framework, the door repair. She answered his questions directly and without embellishment. He found himself thinking that he had been in many meetings, many offices, many conversations, across 2 years of intensive business in Edinburgh, and he could not identify one in which the person across from him had simply said what was true without adjusting it for effect. After the greenhouse, he went back to his room and unpacked his travel bag. He found the seed packets at the side, thyme, winter savory, the tulip and hyacinth bulbs. He looked at them for a moment. Then he took them downstairs and to the library, found Clara at the reading table with her journal, and set the packets on the table beside her. She looked at them. She looked at him. "I bought them in London," he said. "I am not certain what I was intending." She picked up the winter savory and read the front of the packet. "There is a spot for these on the south bench," she said, setting it down with the others. He looked at her. She looked at him, and something that might have become awkward instead became simply what it was. Two people who had just decided, without ceremony, to begin. That afternoon he went to the library. He stood in the room for a moment, looking at the fire that had been lit before he came down, at the book open in the window seat, at the lamp positioned at reading height beside the armchair. He went to the shelves. He walked his finger along the labels in his mother's handwriting, something he had not done in 11 years, something he had deliberately not done, because the handwriting was his mother, and he had sealed his mother away with everything else. He moved slowly along the third shelf. He stopped. Between the collection of poems and the book on English landscape painting, one book sat with the very slight quality of intention rather than habit, placed there rather than simply shelved. He pulled it out. A folded envelope fell into his hand. His name on the front, not his title. Edmund, in her handwriting. He sat in the armchair by the fire and opened it. He read 7 pages. He was very still when he finished. The fire had burned lower. The afternoon light outside had already begun its early descent. He read it again. This time for the shape of it, the way she described the almost laugh in the greenhouse, briefly and precisely. The way she described the library light going gold and wide, which was exactly the way he had always seen it but had never had language for. She had the language. She had described it exactly. He thought, she wrote all of this and did not send it. He sat with that knowledge for a long time. She came in at 4 o'clock. She stopped in the doorway and saw him, and saw the letter in his hands, and something in her expression settled, not relief exactly, but the settling of a breath that has been quietly held. "Why did you not send it?" he said. She came inside. She sat in the window seat. She looked at him steadily. "I did not know if you were ready," she said, "for any of what is in it. And now?" She looked at the pages in his hands. "I think you found it at the right time," she said. "That is why I put it in the library." He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat. He thought about everything it represented, not just what she had written, but the decision not to send it, which was its own kind of understanding about him. She had known, without knowing him well, that he needed to come to this himself. He said, "Tell me about the schoolboy, the one who asked you the direct question." Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but the material it is made of. "William Marsh," she said, 9 years old. His sister is the school teacher. He asks direct questions about everything. Helen says it makes him challenging in the classroom and valuable as a person. I agree with her assessment entirely. "What exactly did he ask you?" She told him, word for word. Edmund was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fire. "And you said it was a complicated question," he said. "It is," she said. "Or it was. It is less complicated now than it was 3 months ago." He looked at her. She looked at him. Outside the library window, the January moors lay flat and still under a white sky. The fire between them burned with a steady, comfortable warmth, and Edmund Ashford, who had spent 11 years running from this room, sat in it with his wife across from him, and felt something in his chest that had been frozen for a long time begin, very slowly, to move. They ate dinner together that evening in the dining room for the first time since his arrival. Not formally, not with ceremony, just the two of them at one end of the long table, with a fire burning in the grate, and Ruth's cooking on the plates, and the particular quality of ordinary companionship that Edmund had not experienced in this house since his childhood. He noticed, during dinner, that they talked easily, not about significant things, about the grounds, about the blocked culvert, about the school, and what William Marsh had asked Clara that afternoon, which had been whether the Duke had always lived in Edinburgh, or whether he had once lived at the Manor, and what it had been like if so. Edmund asked what she had told him. "I told him that you had grown up at the Manor," she said, "that you had lived here until you were 23, and that it was a complicated thing, leaving a place you had grown up in, and that people sometimes needed a long time before they could find their way back." He was quiet for a moment. "That is accurate," he said. "I thought so," she said. After dinner, they went to the library, which was where the evenings ended, it seemed, by mutual but unspoken agreement. The library was the room that the house itself appeared to intend for evenings. The fireplace at the right height, the chairs at the right angles, the window seat and the lamp, and the arrangement of the shelves creating a room that had been designed, by someone who understood rooms, for the specific purpose of spending long, quiet hours in. Clara read. He looked at the books on the shelves, pulling one out occasionally, reading a page or a chapter or an index, putting it back. He found 3 volumes he did not recognize and suspected were acquired after his mother's death. He asked Clara about them, and she confirmed that she had added them to the collection over the past few months, choosing things that seemed to belong. He read the back of each one. "You chose well," he said. "It is a very complete collection," she said. It was not difficult to identify what it needed. He thought about this, about the quality of attention required to look at someone else's carefully built collection and understand what it was reaching toward and find what it needed to complete itself. He thought about the quality of attention that also built a household from minimal resources and a village relationship from nothing and a working knowledge of an estate from 11 years of neglect. He thought, "This is not an ordinary person. I knew she was not ordinary in October. I sent her away anyway." He said, "I have been thinking about what you said, when you told me you were not alone here, the village and the staff." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I want you to know that I understand," he said, "that I left you in a place that was cold and empty and understaffed, and that you made it what it is. I understand that. I have been trying to be clear with myself about that fact, because I think it is important to be clear about it." She was quiet. "The manor is not warm and inhabited because I came back," he said. "The manor is warm and inhabited because you arrived in October, and refused to let it be otherwise. She set her book down. She looked at him with that direct, clear gaze. "That is true," she said. "And I appreciate that you said it." She paused. "But it is also true that the manor is complete now, in a way it was not before you came back. A house with people in it is a different thing from a house with a person in it, even if the person was managing very well alone." She looked at the shelves, the fire, the window. "She organized this room for 2 chairs," she said, "not 1. He looked at the 2 armchairs by the fireplace. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He did not leave. He had told his secretary in Edinburgh to expect him back by Friday. He had told Drummond a few days at most. He sent telegrams on Friday evening that were brief and gave no reason for the extension, because he did not have a reason he was willing to put into a telegram yet. He stayed. He settled into Renly, the way all real settling happens, not in one deliberate act, but in accumulation. Each day he stayed, added a slight claim on the next, the way the warmth Clara had put into the manor walls had accumulated, consistently, quietly, in a manner that could not be undone overnight. He found the rhythms of the house. Not the rhythms of his childhood, which had been his mother's and belonged to her. Those rhythms were gone, and he did not try to restore them, because attempting to restore them would have been a kind of pretending. What existed now were different rhythms, organized around a different person, and he found them and moved into them gradually. Clara moved at her own pace, which was not his. He had always been a fast mover, efficient, directed, the kind of man who walked briskly, even when there was nowhere urgent to be, because briskness was a state of mind, rather than a response to circumstance. She moved with deliberate intention that was never slow in any lazy sense, but that built in consideration at each stage, the way a person moves when they have learned that rushing has a cost and patience has a return. On the difficult mornings, and he identified these quickly, within the first few days, because she came down later and moved differently and ate less. She simply had a slow day. She did not apologize for it. She said, if anyone asked, that today was slower, and then she had a slow day, the library, a book, tea when Dottie brought it, rest without drama or concealment. She did not ask for help, and she did not pretend she did not need rest. He found this hard to watch, the first few times. Not because anything about it distressed him in relation to her health. She managed it with complete matter-of-factness that made clear she had the situation entirely in hand. What was hard was what it required from him. To stand still inside it. To not direct it toward a productive outcome, or accelerate it, or manage it in any way. Just to let it be what it was, for as long as it needed to be. He practiced standing still. He was not naturally good at standing still. He was good at motion, at efficiency, at filling every hour with work that had an outcome. Standing still required him to simply be present in a moment without attempting to improve it, which was a skill he had evidently let atrophy sometime in the past decade. He went to the greenhouse before her on the 3rd morning, without deciding to. He knew where the watering can was kept. He knew approximately what each bed and pot needed, because he had watched her twice. He went ahead of her and watered the plants. She came in at 7:20 and found him finishing the herbs. She looked at the pots. She looked at him. The thyme is still a bit dry, she said, and handed him the can. He watered the thyme. She moved to the tomato seedlings she was hardening off on the south bench. Neither of them commented on the situation. This was one of her most significant qualities, he was learning. She did not make things into more than they were. She did not make scenes of moments or announce the significance of small changes. She accepted facts as they arrived and responded practically. And a man watering her greenhouse before breakfast was simply a fact to be received and responded to practically. He found this remarkable. He had not known, until he encountered it consistently, how much human interaction involved the management of how things appeared, rather than the acknowledgement of what they were. He arranged for the north corridor chimneys to be properly swept. He had fires lit in those rooms the same day, and walked through them and felt the warmth moving through corridors that had been cold for 11 years. He stood in the doorway of each room for a long moment. He found the landscape painting in the attic on a rainy Saturday when he had run out of outdoor tasks. Large canvas, sea cliffs in autumn, the sky the particular dark gold of a northern afternoon. He recognized it from his childhood, the sitting room wall, exactly where it had always been. He brought it down himself, and hung it with Pierce's help on the wall in the sitting room that Clara's journal had noted as needing something. He went to tell her it was there. She came and looked at it. "That is the right wall for it," she said. Not performed for his benefit, simply true. He wrote to Drummond, a longer letter than his letters usually were, which he noticed and did not adjust, because the length was genuine. He explained the situation at the estate clearly and professionally, proposed the modified arrangement of quarterly visits and postal management, and asked Drummond's assessment. Drummond wrote back in his plain, efficient way. The arrangement was workable, more than workable, actually slightly preferable to the past 4 months, since Edmund's physical presence in Edinburgh had always introduced a certain productive reorganization of things that did not need reorganizing. He was glad Edmund had gone north. He wished him well. He had added a postscript. Whatever the reason, it was clearly the right decision. Edmund showed the postscript to Clara. She read it. Something quiet moved across her face. "He sounds sensible," she said. "He is," Edmund said. "He is also accurate about the reorganizing." "You reorganized the library card index on Tuesday," she said. "It is better organized now," he said. "By subject and acquisition date," she said. "That is more useful for certain research purposes." "Perhaps," she said, and there was something in her voice that he now knew was the sound she made when she was amused and deciding whether to show it. They went through her working journal together at the library table that evening, going room by room through the South Wing plan. She had thought through everything clearly, and when he disagreed with a priority, she made her case, and twice he was wrong and she was right, and he changed his position both times. He was not used to changing his position. He found it, each time, more clarifying than diminishing. He thought that was probably an important thing to understand about himself, and filed it accordingly. He walked with her to the village the following Thursday, their directions overlapping, and then continuing to overlap because neither of them turned where they might have. In the village he spoke to Charles Webb for the first time in 11 years. He asked about the store, listened to the answers, made 2 specific suggestions. He watched Charles Webb's expression move from wariness through assessment to something approaching genuine regard. When they walked on, Clara said, "You did that well." He had legitimate points, Edmund said. "Yes," she said. "Most people do, when they have been paying attention long enough." A pause. "He has been managing below a dark manor for 11 years. "I know," he said. She did not add anything to that. She did not need to. The knowledge sat between them, acknowledged and present, not requiring elaboration. On a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of January, after the library and the fire and the reading, he looked across at Clara, who had fallen asleep over her book, her head against the curtain, her feet tucked as always. He sat and looked at her for a moment. He went quietly and laid a blanket over her, because the fire was burning lower and the north air was working at the walls, as it always did at this hour. He went back to his chair and put another log on. He picked up his book. He acknowledged, sitting in the firelight of his dead mother's library with his unexpected wife asleep across the room, that he was happy. Not dramatically, not in any way requiring announcement, just solidly, thoroughly, quietly happy, the kind made of small things. The thyme he had watered that morning, the letter from Drummond in the desk, the sound of her breathing, the peppermints in the dish on the table that had appeared there when he brought them in from the village and stayed, because neither of them had moved them, which meant neither of them wanted to. The log on the fire caught and settled. Outside, the Northumberland winter was wide and still and full of stars. The manor was warm around him. He read until midnight. He was, in every way that mattered, home. February arrived, and then March, and the manor moved through the late winter with the established, confident rhythm of a household that has found its pace and is no longer improvising. The south wing ceilings were inspected and found to have 2 sections that needed addressing. Edmund arranged for a plasterer from Aldwick, who came 1 week in February and worked methodically through the issue. The drainage culvert in the kitchen garden was dug out by Tom from the village and cleared in an afternoon. The cutting garden south of the greenhouse was turned and prepared for spring. The greenhouse itself was beginning to produce in earnest. The herbs on the south shelf were lush and fragrant. Clara cut rosemary for the kitchen every week now, and Dottie took sprigs of lavender for her rooms, and the thyme went into Ruth's cooking. The tomato seedlings in their trays were outgrowing their first pots, and would need to be moved to the kitchen garden within the month. Edmund watered the seedlings every morning before breakfast. This had become as established as anything else in the house. Clara in the greenhouse first, then Edmund, the watering can passing between them without ceremony. The morning tasks distributed in the way that two people working together distribute tasks, which is naturally, and without particular discussion, based on who is better placed to do what. He had begun to learn her patterns in the same way you learn the patterns of weather or of light, not as rules, but as tendencies, and tendencies with their own logic that rewarded understanding. He knew which days were likely to be difficult for her, and on those days, he took the early greenhouse round himself and had tea ready in the kitchen when she came down. He knew she read in the evenings with total absorption and should not be interrupted between 8 and 10 unless something was genuinely urgent. He knew she thought better when she could walk, and that the best conversations they had were walking conversations, on the lane or the grounds, in motion. She learned his patterns too. She knew he worked best in the mornings, that the early hours were his most productive, and she arranged the household's needs around this, so that the morning was clear for his correspondence, and the afternoons were when the practical joint work happened. She knew he reorganized things when he was thinking something through, and that the reorganizing was a form of processing, rather than dissatisfaction with the existing arrangement, and she had stopped commenting on the reorganizing, because commenting on it only self-consciously acknowledged something that was better accepted as a harmless tendency. She told him this one morning. "You reorganize things when you are working through a problem," she said. "I have noticed it since your first week. It does not mean anything about the original organization." He looked at her. "I know," she said. "You think it does mean something about the original organization, but you also reorganize the greenhouse pots when you are thinking about something entirely unrelated to pots, and then reorganize them back the next day. So I think the reorganizing is the thinking, rather than the assessment." He looked at the greenhouse pots, which he had in fact rearranged that morning, while thinking about the reply he owed to Drummond. "That may be accurate," he said. "It is accurate," she said pleasantly, and went back to her work. He wrote the letter to Drummond that afternoon, which was both necessary and 6 days overdue, and found it took him 20 minutes, which was considerably less than he had expected. Helen Marsh came to the Manor for tea on the last Sunday of February, not at Clara's invitation specifically. Helen Marsh had the confident social manner of a woman who understood that standing on ceremony was inefficient, and had suggested the visit herself. She came on Sunday afternoon and stayed 3 hours, and she and Edmund spent most of those 3 hours disagreeing about the historical significance of a particular period in English agricultural reform, a discussion that Dottie, who had brought the tea, later reported to her sister in the village as the most lively thing she had heard in the Manor dining room in 30 years. Clara sat with her tea and her book and let them argue. When Helen left, Edmund came back to the library where Clara was reading. "She is a remarkable person," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "She is. And she is extremely good at her work, which the school does not yet fully support in the material sense." He looked at her. "What does the school need?" he said. She looked up from her book. "Properly?" she said. "Properly," he said. She put down the book. She went to get her journal. They spent the next 2 hours at the library table, going through what the school needed: a proper supply of writing materials, a complete set of maps, a new edition of a comprehensive natural history. The roof over the left classroom needed repair before another winter. The outbuilding at the back, if converted, would make a second teaching room and allow the older children to work separately from the younger ones, which Helen had told Clara was the single change that would most improve the quality of education for all 12 children. Edmund made notes. He asked specific questions. He wrote a letter to his solicitor the following morning, detailing the proposed support for the village school as a charge against the estate, which was his by right as the Manor's lord, and which he had been neglecting for 11 years, along with everything else. Mr. Pierce, who delivered the sealed letter to the post, allowed himself, on the walk back to the Manor, a very small smile. Summer came to Renly-on-Moor without making too much of itself. This was the nature of the North. It did not produce the extravagant, insisting warmth of the South, did not demand admiration or turn every day into a statement. It arrived quietly, building from the careful warmth of May into something genuinely golden by July. The light that came with it was the best light in the world, long and clear and tilted at an angle that made everything look considered and real, and it stayed until 10 in the evening and left the mornings wide and bright before 6. The kitchen garden was producing. Clara had planted it in late March on a morning still cold enough to show her breath, and now the rows she and Meg had laid out with such deliberate care were full and heavy. Lettuce and beans and herbs in abundance. Courgettes multiplying faster than 2 people in a household could consume. Ruth had begun making chutney. Meg had opinions about the chutney. Clara had let them resolve this between themselves. Edmund had taken over the southern end of the kitchen garden for tomatoes. He had started the seedlings in the greenhouse in February, which was perhaps earlier than strictly necessary. He had sourced a specific variety from the same catalog Clara had originally ordered for herb seeds, had built the cane supports himself over 2 careful afternoons in April, and now tended his section of the garden with the focused, methodical energy of a man who has found something that rewards precision and is applying himself to it accordingly. There were a great many tomatoes, more, Clara suspected, than had been strictly planned. She observed this through the kitchen window on the mornings when she was inside and he was out, standing in the garden with his sleeves rolled and his hands at work in the vines, and she thought, there you are. That is the person who was in that closed-up manor all along. She did not say this aloud. There was no need to say aloud what was simply true. Helen Marsh's reading circle met on Wednesday evenings at the schoolhouse. It had started in March with 4 people, and by June had grown to 11, requiring Helen to rearrange the chairs and produce 3 additional ones she had apparently been storing, in anticipation of exactly this. Clara had been attending since the beginning. Edmund had been coming since April. He had not planned to come the first Wednesday. He had walked Clara to the schoolhouse because their routes overlapped, and Helen Marsh had appeared in the doorway just as he was about to continue past. "Would you like to come in, Your Grace?" she said, with the direct, completely unintimidated expression of a woman who taught 12 children and was afraid of very little. "Yes," he said, before he had considered whether he wanted to. He had not missed a Wednesday since. He and Helen Marsh disagreed about nearly everything they read. They disagreed about the Victorian novel, about the correct interpretation of 2 separate poems, about whether chronological or thematic approaches better served the teaching of history. The history disagreement ran across 3 consecutive Wednesdays without resolution and was, both of them acknowledged, productive. Clara sat at these meetings with her book and her tea and watched them and thought, this is what he needed. People who are not adjusted by his presence. People who will simply argue with him. The village had adjusted its view of the Duke of Renly. Not completely. Resentment that has accumulated over 11 years does not dissolve in 8 months. But it had been steadily reduced by small practical genuine things. The repaired lane, the supply arrangement at Charles Webb's store, the books at the school, the walking conversations on the main street, the manor windows lit on the hill every evening. The village had not declared the past forgiven. It had simply moved, in the practical northern way, to noting that things were currently better and allowing that to matter. Charles Webb had a photograph behind the counter now. Edmund had seen it on a morning visit in June. A small framed photograph, clearly old, showing a woman in the village street, half turned, one hand up to her hat, caught between one moment and the next. The late Duchess, Charles said when he noticed. She used to come in on Saturdays, before she was ill. I always bought peppermints. He pointed to the jar on the counter. Same kind. I keep them because people still buy them. Edmund stood at the counter and looked at the photograph. His mother at perhaps 30, vivid and mid-motion in the village street. He had a dozen formal portraits of her at home. He had never seen this one. He bought peppermints without explaining why, and carried them back to the manor, and put them in a dish on the library table, because that was the correct place for them, and he knew it without needing to think about it. Clara found them that afternoon. She took one without comment. That was that. On a Tuesday morning in the middle of July, Edmund came downstairs before Clara had risen. She was having a slow morning, had come down briefly for tea and gone back up, which he had noted and accounted for in his own plans without fuss. And he went to the library and sat on the floor beside the chest and opened it. He had known the chest was there. Clara had told him about it, shown him the letters and the drawings, handled everything with the same careful respect she brought to all things connected to his mother. He had approached the chest twice, and then found other things to do, not because he could not face it, but because he had wanted to face it correctly, at the right moment, with the right quality of readiness. The morning felt correct. He sat with the chest for 2 hours. He read the letters in order, from earliest to most recent, which meant he read his mother's life from the inside, as she had been living it. Not a retrospective, not a grief exercise, a record of a person who had been fully alive, and who had known it, and had written about the ordinary things of her life, with the warmth and precision of someone who understood that ordinary things were actually extraordinary if you paid sufficient attention. He read a letter she had written to her friend Charlotte about a September afternoon at Renly, the light over the moors, the garden in its late summer state, a baby asleep in the pram on the lawn while she sat nearby writing in the long amber light. She described it with such precision that he could feel the quality of that specific afternoon in the writing. He was the baby asleep in the pram. He read the drawings, his own childhood work, kept in order by approximate age, from the early scribbles to the more recognizable pictures of the moors and the manor and the greenhouse. He held the small shoe. He turned the silver hairbrush in his hands. Then he read the greenhouse letter. She had written it 18 months before she died, when she had not yet known she was ill, full of the confidence of a person who believes they have considerable time ahead. She described a plan for a second greenhouse structure, detailed, thought through from every angle. The east wall, she had determined, had exactly the right sun angle. The drainage from the main structure could be extended at moderate cost. She had identified 3 citrus varieties she believed would winter successfully in a northern greenhouse with careful temperature management. She had been excited. It was visible in every line. She had not had time to build it. Clara came in at noon. She saw him on the floor with the letters around him, and came and sat beside him, close, but not crowding, her back against the bookcase, her hands in her lap. He showed her the greenhouse letter, without explaining what it was. She read it quietly and gave it back. "There is space along the east wall," she said. "The sun angle is right." She assessed it correctly. He looked at the letter. "She thought everything through carefully," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "I recognize that from the library, the way she organized it. Everything considered, nothing left to chance. She was someone who thought things through completely before she began." She paused. She would have been very good at the list. He looked at the letter in his hands. He thought about what his mother had planned that she had not had time for. He thought about what it meant that someone had come into this house, preserved the evidence of those plans, kept everything safe until he was ready to find it. "I would like to build the second greenhouse," he said. Clara looked at him. "In spring, when the ground is workable," he said, using her specifications, as closely as we can reconstruct them from this letter. "George Potts is the man to work with," Clara said. "She is very specific about the measurements. He will know how to read them." "I will speak to him," Edmund said. She looked at him for a moment, with the look she had, not quite a smile, but carrying all the warmth of one. "She would be glad," Clara said quietly. He put the letter back with the others, in order, and closed the chest. He stayed sitting for another minute, not because he needed to, but because standing felt, at this exact moment, like moving through something too quickly. Clara sat beside him, and did not speak. He stood, he held out his hand, she took it and stood, and he kept hold of it a moment longer, and she did not move away. They stood together in the library, with the summer air moving through the open windows, and the moors wide and gold outside. Edmund said, "I want to tell you something." She looked at him. "I have been trying, for several months, to understand what happened when I came back in April," he said. "I keep arriving at the same answer, which is that I had been waiting, without knowing I was waiting, for something I had decided no longer existed." He looked at the portrait above the fireplace. His mother at 19, alive and direct. "After she died, I decided that what I had lost was gone completely. Not just her, but what she had represented, the version of my life that had warmth in it. I decided, without quite making it a decision, that the correct response was to not want those things anymore." Clara listened. "It worked for a while," he said. "Edinburgh was useful for that. It is a good city for keeping yourself in motion." And then Pierce wrote, And I bought seeds I had no coherent explanation for, and I got on a train, and I arrived here to find that what I had decided was gone, had been here the entire time, waiting for someone to notice it. The house, Clara said. The house, he said. And you, who had understood it before I was able to. She looked at the window. The moors outside were that extraordinary gold of a northern summer morning, the long grass moving in the warm, slow wind. I did not do anything heroic, she said. I arrived here, and the house needed work, and I did the work. That is the extent of it. That is not a small thing, he said. No, she said. But it is not a mysterious thing either. It is simply what you do when you are given something worth caring for. She paused. You would have done the same, if you had arrived here fresh. He considered this honestly. Perhaps, he said. But I did not arrive fresh. I could not have. I had too much history with this place. I could only arrive the way I arrived, after years of being away, after someone else had done what I could not. He looked at her. You did it alone. I was not alone, she said simply. She meant Dottie and Meg, and Pierce and Helen Marsh, and the village, and the house itself, which had asked her to stay, and which she had stayed for. No, he said, you were not alone. But no one assigned it to you. No one asked you to begin. You simply looked at an empty, cold house and decided to begin anyway. She was quiet. I spent 11 years leaving, he said. She did not add anything to that. It did not need anything added. I owe you a proper apology, he said. For October. For how the beginning of all of this was handled. You have said that, she said. I am saying it again, he said. Because it deserves to be said more than once, and I am not certain once was enough. She was quiet for a moment. Then I accept it again, she said. He looked at her, this woman who had arrived in October into a cold, empty house, without complaint, without expectation, without any particular demand on him beyond the ordinary dignities, and had simply begun. Who had written him 7 pages of the most honest thing he had ever been given, and then decided not to send it, because she thought he needed to come to it himself. Who had been right about that, as she was right about most things, not loudly, not triumphantly, just quietly, and with the patience of someone who had learned that being right only mattered if you were also kind. He said, the years I spent away were the longest of my life. She turned toward the window. The summer moors were gold in the morning light, the particular gold that lasted 20 minutes at this time of day, on this kind of morning. She had learned the light schedules of every room and every hour in this house. She had learned them because she had been here, paying attention. You were waiting, she said. Yes, he said, I was. He reached over. She took his hand and held it, and they stood at the library window with the life they had made, unplanned and improbable and absolutely real, spread out before them, in the wide, unhurried Northumberland light. Around them, the manor was warm and full and inhabited. The greenhouse was green with growing things. The kitchen garden below was full and orderly. On the library table, there was a dish of peppermints. On the shelf above the fireplace, a young woman in a yellow dress looked out from her portrait with her direct and living eyes, and the room she had loved and organized and filled was once again what it had always been meant to be. Renly Manor held them both, the way it had always been waiting to,